The words hit Sarah Dugan like a slap across the face, sharp and final and wrong in every way she could measure. Ride back the way you came. This town has heard enough from you. Sheriff Walt Pruett stood in the middle of Redemption's Main Street, his weathered hands resting on the worn leather of his gun belt, his eyes carved from something colder than stone. He was not looking at Sarah. He was looking at the man standing beside her, the man who had ridden into Redemption 3 weeks ago on a dusty roan horse with nothing but a saddlebag and a name that seemed too clean for a territory this rough. Gideon Keene. And Gideon Keene did not move. He stood there in the late afternoon sun, tall and still, his dark hat casting a shadow across the sharp line of his jaw, and he did not reach for his gun, and he did not back down, and he did not take his eyes off the sheriff. The whole town seemed to be holding its breath. Sarah could feel it, the tightening of the air, the way the women on the porch of the general store had gone silent, the way old Pete Mallory had stopped sweeping outside the barber shop and just stood there with the broom hanging loose in his hands like a forgotten thought. "Sheriff," Gideon said, and his voice was so low and so steady it made Sarah's chest ache. "I will ride when I am ready to ride." That was when Pruett's hand moved to his holster, and that was when Sarah stepped forward. She moved before she even realized what she was doing, her boots finding the dry earth between the two men, her body cutting the line between the sheriff's hand and Gideon's chest. She heard the sharp intake of breath from the porch. She heard someone mutter her name like a warning. But she kept her eyes on Pruett because Pruett was the danger here. Pruett was the one with the hidden motive and the tight jaw and the secret that had been eating at this town for longer than any of them wanted to admit. "Walt," she said quietly, "you do not want to do this. Get out of the way, Sarah." "I will not." The afternoon stretched like a wire pulled too taut. Dust moved in the street between them, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk called out over the open plain. It had not always been like this. 3 weeks ago, Sarah Dugan had not known Gideon Keene's name. 3 weeks ago, Redemption, New Mexico had been nothing more than the small, stubborn town she had spent the last 2 years of her life trying to hold together after everything in her world had fallen apart. But something had been wrong in Redemption long before Gideon rode in. Something had been rotting underneath the surface, hidden from plain sight, buried under years of quiet intimidation and borrowed fear. To understand how Sarah Dugan ended up standing in the street with her body between a lawman's gun and a stranger's heart, you had to go back to the beginning. You had to go back to the morning Gideon Keene rode into town. It was the 3rd week of September, 1882, and the heat had not broken the way everyone in Redemption had been praying it would. The summer had been long and punishing, and the land around the town looked scorched and brittle, the kind of dry that made a person feel like the world itself was angry about something. Sarah was outside the small schoolhouse where she worked as a teacher, sweeping the front steps, when she heard the sound of hooves on the road coming in from the east. She looked up. The rider came in slowly, which was the first thing she noticed. Men who came into Redemption fast were usually men with something to prove or something to run from. This man came in at a quiet walk, like he was reading the town as he moved through it, measuring it against something he carried inside himself. He was lean and broad-shouldered, somewhere in his late 20s she guessed, with dark hair showing at the edges of a hat that had seen too much sun. His horse was a good animal, well kept despite the dust of travel, and that told Sarah something too. A man who kept his horse well was a man who understood that the world did not owe him anything. He stopped his horse in front of the general store, swung down with the ease of someone who had spent more of his life in a saddle than out of one, and looped the reins over the hitching post without rushing. Sarah watched him from the steps of the schoolhouse, broom in her hands, telling herself she was only looking because newcomers were rare in Redemption, and rare was always worth noticing. He turned, as if he felt her eyes on him, and looked straight at her across the width of the street. Sarah looked away. She went back to sweeping, But the sweep of the broom felt different after that, slower, like part of her attention had stayed on the other side of the street without her permission. She learned his name an hour later, when she stopped by Myra Calloway's dry goods store for the pencils she had ordered for the schoolchildren. Myra was already wound tight with excitement, the way she always got when something interesting happened in town, her round face flushed and her hands working fast as she packaged up Sarah's order. "Did you see him ride in?" Myra asked, before Sarah had even gotten both feet through the door. "I saw a rider," Sarah said carefully. "Gideon Keene. That is his name. He told it to Jacob Willis straight out, no hesitation. Said he is looking for work. Said he heard there might be something for a man who knows cattle and fences and the particular work of keeping a ranch in order." Sarah set her coin on the counter. "There is always work for a man who is willing." "Walt Pruett did not look pleased," Myra said, dropping her voice to something between a whisper and a warning. "Came out of the jail office the moment the man tied up his horse. Stood there on the porch and just watched him. You know the way Walt watches." Sarah knew the way Walt watched. She had been on the receiving end of it enough times since her husband Daniel had died 2 years ago. Daniel Dugan had been the kind of man who asked questions, the kind of man who wrote things down in a ledger and compared numbers and noticed when things did not add up. And things in Redemption had not been adding up for a long time. Daniel had died of a fever, or so the town had been told, and Sarah had buried her husband in the dry ground behind the church and gone on living, because she did not know what else to do, and because she had a classroom full of children who needed someone to show them that going on was possible. But she had never fully believed it was a fever. Not after she found his private papers, not after she read what he had written in the weeks before he died. She took her pencils and left Myra's store, and she told herself that Gideon Keene was none of her concern. She told herself that for approximately 4 days. On the 5th day, Gideon Keene appeared at the schoolhouse door. He knocked, which startled her, because the door was open and men in Redemption generally did not knock on open doors. She was alone inside, the children having gone home an hour before, and she was at the chalkboard working out the arithmetic problem she planned to give the older students tomorrow. She turned at the sound, and there he was, filling the doorframe with his hat in his hands and the late sun behind him making a kind of rough gold out of the edge of his silhouette. "Miss Dugan," he said. "Mrs. Dugan," she corrected, though she had been a widow for 2 years and the correction cost her something every time she made it. He accepted the correction with a small, respectful nod. "I apologize, Mrs. Dugan. I was told you might know who owns the Carver land southeast of town. I am looking to speak with whoever holds that land about the possibility of work." Sarah set down her chalk. "Who told you to ask me?" "Jacob Willis. Said you know the property records better than anyone." That was true, unfortunately. After Daniel died, Sarah had become the unofficial keeper of a number of the town's practical records, partly because she was educated and partly because no one else wanted the responsibility, and partly, she suspected, because having a widow organize the town's paperwork meant the paperwork was less likely to ask awkward questions than it would be if a man with ambition were keeping it. "The Carver land is owned by a man named Roland Hatch," she said, moving to the small desk where she kept a locked box of her own private record-keeping. "He lives out of town now, Tucson, I believe, has not worked the land in 2 years. Is he looking to lease it?" "He might be. I could write to him on your behalf if you have a firm proposal." She paused. "Why Redemption, Mr. Keene? There are towns along this territory with more opportunity than this one." He looked at her for a moment before he answered, and she had the unsettling feeling that he was deciding how much truth to give her. "I have a specific interest in this area," he said finally. "Something I need to look into." "Something," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." He was not going to say more. She could see that clearly enough. She wrote down Roland Hatch's Tucson address from memory and handed it across to him. Their fingers did not touch, because she was careful about that, about the careless ways that two people could find their skin in the same place at the same time and what that could mean in a small town that watched everything. He thanked her. He turned to go. "Mr. Keene," she said, and she did not know why she said the next part, only that it felt like the honest thing to do. "Be careful who you ask questions of in this town. Not everyone here is as interested in the truth as they might appear." He turned back and looked at her fully for the first time, and she had to work to hold the eye contact because his gaze was very direct and very dark, and it had a quality to it she could not immediately name, like he was used to seeing things clearly and paying attention to what he saw. "Same could be said of most places," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "but it is more dangerous here than in most." He held her gaze for one more breath. Then he settled his hat back on his head and walked out into the evening, and Sarah stood in her empty classroom with chalk dust on her fingers, and the strange, uncomfortable awareness that something had just shifted in the quiet world she had been carefully maintaining for 2 years. Gideon Keene had come to redemption looking for the truth about his brother. He told her this on their second real conversation, which happened 6 days after the schoolhouse meeting, at a point when the pressure of what he was carrying had clearly become too heavy to manage entirely alone. He found her at the well behind the church on a Sunday afternoon, the hour when most of redemption was inside or napping, or doing the quiet restorative things that Sunday afternoons in small towns were made for. He had not planned to tell her. She would understand that later. It came out the way truths often come out when someone has been holding them alone for too long, in a rush, with a rawness to it that embarrassed him afterward. His brother's name was Cole Keene. He had been a ranch hand in and around Redemption 3 years ago, before Gideon's time in the territory, before Gideon had even known Cole was in New Mexico. Cole had written to their mother twice from here, cheerful letters that said the land was good and the work was honest, and he was thinking of sending for them once he had saved enough. And then the letters had stopped. And then nothing. And then a rumor, traveling slow the way rumors do in the West, reaching Gideon in Texas 18 months later, that Cole Keene had met with some kind of accident in Redemption and had not survived it. The word accident had been used very carefully by the person who told Gideon this, carefully enough that Gideon had understood immediately that the word was a polite fiction covering something darker. Sarah listened to all of this standing at the well with her bucket in her hands, and when he finished she was quiet for a long time. The Sunday afternoon settled around them, warm and still. "Cole Keene," she said. "I remember that name." Gideon went very still. "You do? My husband mentioned him in his papers." She set the bucket down carefully. Daniel had written down several names of men who had left the area suddenly or died in unclear circumstances. Cole Keene was among them. He had a note next to the name. It said, and I remember this exactly because I have read those pages too many times, it said, "Ask Pruett where this one went." The silence between them took on weight. "Your husband suspected Pruett," Gideon said. "My husband died shortly after writing those notes." Another silence, longer this time. A mourning dove called from the cottonwood tree at the edge of the churchyard, soft and repetitive, as if it was trying to remind them that grief was a familiar thing in this part of the world. "I am sorry about your husband, Mrs. Dugan," Gideon said, and the way he said it was simple and genuine and nothing extra, no performance in it, just a person acknowledging another person's loss, and Sarah felt the back of her throat tighten in the way it still did sometimes when Daniel was mentioned without warning. "Thank you," she said. "He was a good man. He was trying to do right by this town. And Pruett, Walt Pruett has been sheriff of Redemption for 11 years. He controls what comes in and what goes out. He controls who stays and who leaves. He has friends in high places in the county seat, and he has a way of making problems disappear quietly." She paused. "People here are afraid of him. They will not say so. They will smile at him on the street and invite him to Sunday dinners and talk about what a good lawman he is. But they are afraid." "Are you afraid of him?" Gideon asked. Sarah thought about the honest answer to that question. "I am cautious of him," she said at last. which is different from afraid. Being afraid is something you cannot help. Being cautious is something you choose. He looked at her with that direct, paying attention look again. That is a useful distinction. I find it keeps me moving, she said simply. They stood for a moment longer at the well, and then Sarah picked up her bucket and said she needed to get back. And Gideon said he was grateful for what she had shared. And they parted ways with the careful propriety of two people who understood exactly how much scrutiny a small town kept on its residents. But something had changed between them. Something that had nothing to do with secrets or danger or the name Keene, and everything to do with the particular loneliness of two people who had both been carrying something heavy alone and had just discovered, quite unexpectedly, that there might be someone else willing to stand on the other side of the weight. The next 2 weeks were careful and layered, and full of the particular tension of a situation building towards something that could not yet be named. Gideon had taken work at the Hollies Ranch 2 miles east of town, the same land where Cole had apparently worked before his disappearance. He came to town every few days for supplies or conversation or simply because redemption was the nearest point of civilization, and a man needed to see other human faces sometimes. And Sarah noticed. She tried not to notice, but she was a schoolteacher and noticing things was built into the bones of her, that Gideon always seemed to pass by the schoolhouse on his way in and his way out. He did not always stop, but he always slowed. On the day he did stop, it was because he heard her raising her voice inside, which was not something Sarah Dugan did often enough to ignore. He came to the door to find her standing face to face with Harvey Klein, who was the father of 2 of her students and who had decided, that particular Thursday afternoon, that Sarah was teaching his children from books that were too new and too liberal in their thinking, which was his way of saying he did not like the idea of his children learning that the world was larger and more complicated than Redemption, New Mexico. These children have a right to know what is in the world beyond this county, Sarah was saying, her voice pulled tight with the effort of staying controlled. And I will not simplify what I teach them to make you more comfortable with your own limitations, Mr. Klein. Harvey Klein, who was a broad, red-faced man with the self-assurance of someone who had never been seriously contradicted, stepped closer to her desk. You forget your place, woman. You are here because this town suffers your presence. You could be replaced. By whom, exactly? Sarah asked, and there was something in her voice now that was not quite fear and not quite bravado, something that lived between the two like a narrow ledge over a great drop. The last teacher left because Walt Pruett told him to. The one before that left because nobody would rent him a house. You want to find someone who will come to Redemption and do this job without complaint and without question. You go right ahead and try. That was when Gideon appeared in the doorway. He did not say anything at first. He simply stood there, and his presence had a quality to it that changed the air in the room without requiring a word. Harvey Klein turned, saw him, and made the calculation that large men with steady eyes and a certain quietness about them generally invite in the minds of bullies, which is the calculation that says this particular conflict is not worth pursuing further at this particular moment. Klein looked back at Sarah. This is not finished, he said, and walked out past Gideon without speaking to him. Gideon stepped fully into the room. You all right? I am perfectly fine, Sarah said, and then sat down heavily in her chair because her knees had decided to go somewhere between solid and reliable, and she needed a moment. Gideon pulled a student's chair to a respectful distance from her desk and sat down in it, which looked a little absurd given his height and the chair's dimensions, and somehow the slight absurdity of it settled something in Sarah's chest. She almost laughed. She pulled the almost laugh back before it arrived, but she felt it and he saw her feel it, and something passed between them in that moment that was quiet and warm and terrifying. You did not need rescuing, he said. No, she agreed. I know that. I just came to stand in the door. You are very good at standing indoors, she said. Now it was his turn to almost laugh. She watched him pull it back too, and the shared experience of almost laughter was oddly intimate, more intimate than she had been with anyone in a long time. "I wanted to tell you something," he said, leaning forward with his forearms resting on his knees, dropping into seriousness the way he dropped into everything, directly and without fuss. "I found something at the Hollies Ranch, in the old bunkhouse that nobody uses anymore. There is a floorboard that does not sit flat, and under it," he paused. "Under it there is a tin box. Inside the box there are letters, 3 of them. They are in my brother's handwriting." Sarah straightened. "Letters to whom?" "To our mother. He never sent them. Or he tried to send them and they were intercepted, I cannot be sure. But they are dated from the weeks before he died." And in the last one, another pause, this one heavier. "In the last one he writes about the sheriff. He writes that he saw something he was not supposed to see, a meeting late at night out on the South Road, men with cattle that were not theirs, moving them in the dark." The room felt very still. "Cattle rustling," Sarah said slowly, "under Pruett's protection. More than protection. From what Cole wrote, Pruett was organizing it. The cattle were being taken from the smaller ranches around here, driven south, sold across the territory line. Someone in authority was covering the trail." "That is why Daniel's numbers did not add up," Sarah said, and her voice had gone very quiet because the pieces were suddenly fitting together in a way that was both terrible and clarifying. "He was tracking the livestock tallies for 3 of the local ranchers. He told me once that the numbers were not matching what the ranchers reported losing to weather and disease. Too many animals disappearing, too quietly, too regularly." Gideon looked at her. "Did your husband tell Pruett what he had found?" "I do not know." She pressed her hand flat on the desk, steadying herself. "I do not know, and that is the thing that I cannot answer, and it is the thing that has kept me awake for 2 years." He let that sit in the air between them, not rushing to fill it with reassurance or false certainty. She appreciated that about him. She had noticed over the course of their few conversations that he did not rush to fill silences. He let things be heavy when they needed to be heavy. "I am going to write to the U.S. Marshal's office," he said. "In Santa Fe. I have the letters. With what you know about your husband's records, we might have enough to bring proper attention to this." "Pruett has friends in the county seat," Sarah reminded him. "The marshal's office is above the county seat." She looked at him steadily. "And while we wait for a response from Santa Fe, what do we do in the meantime?" "We are careful," he said. "We do not let Pruett know what we know. We go about our days normally and we wait." He said it so simply. "We." As if they were already a unit of some kind, as if the decision to stand together in this had been made before either of them had consciously agreed to it. And Sarah noticed this, she noticed the "we," and she filed it away in the place where she kept things that were too significant to examine immediately but too important to let go. "All right," she said, "we are careful. They were not quite careful enough. Or rather, they were careful. But Redemption was the kind of small town where the word careful was never quite small enough to cover the distance between 2 people who were becoming important to each other. People talk in small towns not out of malice always, but out of the simple human hunger for narrative, for events to discuss and meanings to assign. And the narrative being assembled around Sarah Dugan and the stranger Gideon Keene was one that reached Walt Pruett's ears before either of them had had the chance to fully understand it themselves. Pruett came to see Sarah on a Tuesday evening, just before dark, the kind of visit that was socially acceptable in that it happened at her door rather than inside her house, but was clearly not a social call. He stood on her porch with his hat on, which was itself a small act of disrespect. A man who removes his hat at a woman's door is a man who is still trying to be civil. A man who keeps it on has already made a decision about how civil he intends to be. "Evening, Sarah," he said. "Sheriff," she replied, keeping her hand on the doorframe. "I hear you have been spending time with the Keene fella." "I have spoken with him on occasion," she said. "He is a resident of the area and I am acquainted with most of the area's residents." Pruett's eyes were pale blue and very flat, the kind of eyes that made you want to look away even when you were determined not to. "He is not a resident. He is a drifter who came through and has been asking questions he has no business asking." "What kind of questions?" the kind that do not concern him, a pause calibrated for effect. Or you? Sarah kept her expression carefully neutral. Is there something specific you needed, Sheriff? It is getting late and I have lessons to prepare. Pruett looked at her for a long moment. Daniel was a good man, he said, and the use of her dead husband's name felt obscene coming out of his mouth, felt like a threat wearing the costume of a condolence. He had his nose in things that were not his, too. You know how that ended. The blood went cold in Sarah's veins. She did not let it show. She had practice at not letting things show. "Good night, Sheriff," she said, and closed the door. She stood on the inside of the closed door for a full minute, breathing deliberately, listening to his boots cross the porch boards and descend the 2 steps to the ground, listening to the sound of his departing footsteps on the dry earth. Then she went to her writing table, took out paper and pen, and began drafting a letter to the U.S. Marshal's office in Santa Fe. She did not wait for Gideon to write first. She wrote herself, and she was thorough, and she included everything she knew about Daniel's records and the missing livestock tallies, and she mentioned the letters Gideon had found, and she wrote it all in the clear, precise, organized hand of a schoolteacher who understood that clarity was its own form of power. The next morning, she gave the letter to the postal agent, a man named Fredericks who she trusted because he was old and tired and indifferent to local politics, in the way that only the very old and very tired can afford to be. She asked him to send it with the next mail rider. He looked at the address, looked at her, and said he would see to it without another word. She told Gideon what she had done when she saw him 2 days later, stopping at the well again, which had become their meeting point not by design, but by the organic way that 2 people who cannot meet too openly will find a place that is legitimate and unremarkable. He was quiet when she told him, and she could not quite read what was moving across his face. "You did not have to do that," he said. "It puts you in a more visible position." "I know, I did it anyway." "Why?" She looked at the water in the bucket. "Because Pruett came to my door and mentioned my husband," she said, "and I decided I was done being cautious in the way that only benefits people who want me cautious." She paused. "And because your brother deserved to have someone do something, and it seems like you have been alone in that for too long." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, quietly and with an effort she could hear, "Thank you, Sarah." He had used her first name. She noticed this and did not correct it and told herself it was simply a matter of informality that came from shared purpose. But the truth was that her name and his voice had a quality she was not ready to look at directly yet, like something too bright to see fully without preparation. They began to meet more regularly after that, with the letter to Santa Fe out in the world and the waiting having begun. They were circumspect about it, meeting when they could in places that had legitimate reason for both of them to be. But the circumspection was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain because what was happening between them was becoming increasingly difficult to disguise, even from themselves. It was not anything they said. It was in the quality of the attention they gave each other. The way a conversation with Gideon left Sarah feeling like she had been genuinely heard, rather than simply processed by another person's half-listening politeness. It was the way she found herself, in the classroom or at her writing table or in the small kitchen of her house on Sunday mornings, thinking about something he had said 3 days ago, turning it over, finding it still interesting. It was the way he looked for her first when he came to town, before he went anywhere else. They talked about everything. About his life before redemption, the years in Texas working cattle drives with men he admired, and men he did not. The experience of being the younger brother to a person as naturally warm and easy as Cole had been, and feeling the particular pressure of that comparison. About her life in Boston before she married Daniel and came west with him, the shock of the landscape and the loneliness of the first winter, and the slow, difficult, beautiful process of learning to love a place that was nothing like what she had been raised to expect from the world. About books, which she had more of than almost anyone else in redemption, and which she had read until their spines were soft with use. He had read more than she expected, surprising her with references to things she thought only people who had spent time in libraries would know. He told her he had taught himself mostly in the long evenings on cattle drives when some men were gambling and some men were sleeping, and he had always been the kind of person who preferred to have his mind occupied with something that built toward an answer. She told him about her childhood. He told her about his. She told him that she missed the ocean, which she had seen twice in her life, and which had left a mark on her imagination that the desert had never fully replaced, though she had come to love the desert in its own sharp way. He told her that he had never seen the ocean and had always thought he would like to, someday. Someday, he said, and left it open, and the openness of it felt deliberate and meaningful, and she did not push on it, but it stayed with her. He brought her things sometimes, small things, a flowering cactus branch he found on the ride and that he thought she might press into one of her books, a piece of turquoise he picked up from the dry creek bed that was so pure a blue it seemed almost impossible for something to be that color in a landscape so devoted to earth tones. He was not courting her, or if he was doing it so quietly and so carefully that she had complete deniability, and she understood that the care was for her reputation in a town that was watching, for the vulnerability of being a widow woman in 1882 in New Mexico, where everything about a woman's position depended on what people said about her. But she kept the turquoise on her writing table where she could see it. And when he came to town and she saw him across the street, something in her that had been very quiet for 2 years became less quiet, and she stopped telling herself it was simply the kinship of two people with a shared purpose, because it was not that, it had not been just that for a while, and honesty was something she had always valued too much to entirely abandon even when it was inconvenient. 3 weeks after the letter to Santa Fe, Pruett made his move. He had been building toward it. Sarah had felt it the way you feel weather before it arrives, in the pressure and the stillness, in the way Pruett's pale eyes had been finding her more often in public spaces, tracking her with that flat, assessing gaze that said he was measuring a problem and deciding what to do about it. She had felt it in the increased coolness of some of Redemption's residents toward her, the women who had always been friendly but were now just slightly less so, the men who had always tipped their hats to her but now sometimes looked away first. Pruett had been working. He was not stupid. He understood that the most effective way to undermine a person in a small community was slowly, socially, turning the ambient opinion of that community like a tide. He told people that Gideon Keene was a wanted man from Texas. He told people that Sarah Dugan had compromised herself by associating with him. He said these things not all at once and not to everyone at the same time, but in the quiet, incremental way of a man who had been managing public opinion in a small town for 11 years and knew exactly how to plant a seed of doubt and water it with implication. The rumor reached Sarah through Myra Calloway, who told her with the breathless distress of someone who was genuinely fond of Sarah and genuinely frightened of what the rumor might do to her. "He is saying Keene is a fugitive," Myra said, her voice tight with anxiety. "He is saying you have been meeting with him in secret. He is saying," she stopped, gathered herself, "he is saying that you have been helping Keene with something that is against the law." Sarah set down the thread she was using to repair a student's broken book binding and looked at Myra steadily. "None of that is true. I know it is not. I know you, Sarah. But people," Myra twisted her hands together. "People hear things and they do not always remember to measure them against what they know. Has anyone checked whether Gideon Keene is actually wanted anywhere? Walt Pruett is the sheriff. If he says a man is wanted, most people in this town are not going to ask him to prove it." Sarah thought of the letter she had sent to Santa Fe. She had no way to know if it had been received, no way to know if anyone had read it, no way to know if anyone was coming. The U.S. Marshals were stretched thin across a vast territory, and a single letter from a schoolteacher in a small New Mexico town about a county sheriff's corruption was not the kind of thing that necessarily prompted immediate action. She went to find Gideon. He was at the livery working on some piece of tack that needed attention, and he straightened when he saw her face and said, "What happened?" before she had even opened her mouth, because he was apparently very good at reading her face, which should have unsettled her more than it did. She told him. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she most valued about him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I am not wanted anywhere," he said. "I will say that clearly and without equivocation. There is no warrant for me in Texas or anywhere else." "I know that," she said, "but Pruett does not need it to be true. He just needs it to be said. He is trying to push me out of town before the marshal's office responds to your letter." "Yes." Gideon hung the piece of tack on a nail and looked at her. "And if I leave, then your brother's story ends here, and Pruett keeps operating. And whoever comes through this town next and sees something he does not want them to see ends up the same way Cole did." She paused. "And I go back to being a widow in a town where the person responsible for my husband's death is still wearing a badge." He held her gaze. "I am not leaving." "I did not think you were," she said quietly. The confrontation in the street happened the following morning. She had known it was coming. She had felt it the whole night before, lying awake in her small house listening to the silence, and knowing that the silence was temporary and that tomorrow something was going to crack. She was at the schoolhouse early, trying to lose herself in lesson preparation, when she heard the raised voices from the street and looked out the window to see Pruett approaching the hotel where Gideon had been staying since the Holly's Ranch arrangement had ended a few days earlier. She did not stop to think. She went outside. She arrived in the street just as Pruett was delivering his verdict to Gideon, who had come out of the hotel to meet the sheriff in the open air the way a man does when he understands that witnesses matter. "Ride back the way you came," Pruett said, in the carrying, authoritative voice of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed. "This town has heard enough from you." And then he said the other thing. The thing he had never quite said before because he had been maintaining the fiction of legitimacy, but which now, under the pressure of what was coming, came out of him the way poison comes out of a wound that has finally been pushed too hard. "You keep asking about things that do not concern you," Pruett said, and his voice dropped into something quieter and more dangerous, "and you are going to end up the same way your brother ended up, buried in ground nobody visits." The words fell into the morning air and nobody moved. Gideon's face did not change expression, which was remarkable, which was the most controlled thing Sarah had ever witnessed a person do under the circumstances, because what Pruett had just said was a confession, or near enough to one that the distinction barely mattered, and it must have landed in Gideon with the force of everything he had been trying to prove for a year and a half finally being handed to him in the worst possible way. Sarah stepped into the space between them. She felt Pruett's fury at this, the way a person can feel heat coming off something before they touch it. She heard the muttering from the porch. She kept her eyes on Pruett's face and she said, "Walt, you do not want to do this. Get out of the way, Sarah." "I will not. This is not your business. My husband is buried in the ground behind the church," she said, and her voice was steady and clear in the morning air, carrying to the people on the porch, carrying to old Pete Mallory with his broom, carrying to Myra Calloway who had appeared in the door of the general store with her hand over her mouth. "My husband is buried there because he knew what you were doing with the livestock from the smaller ranches. Because he knew about the men you had working for you after dark on the South Road. He was going to bring it to the county seat, and you could not allow that. And Cole Keene is buried somewhere we cannot find because he saw the same things. And I will not get out of the way, Walt, because I have been getting out of the way for 2 years and I am done with it." Pruett's face had gone a terrible color. His hand moved on his gun belt. "You do not want to draw that weapon in front of half the town," Gideon said, his voice low and perfectly controlled, speaking past Sarah's shoulder. "Not when there is a U.S. Marshal riding in from the east who received a full accounting of your activities 3 weeks ago." Pruett's hand stopped. Sarah did not let her face show her surprise, because she did not know if this was true or if it was a gambit, but she kept her face exactly as steady as it had been and she did not move. "That is a lie," Pruett said, but something had shifted in his pale eyes. The flatness had cracked slightly, and what was underneath it was something closer to fear than anything Sarah had ever seen in that face. "It is not a lie," Gideon said. "His name is Marshal Samuel Cross, and he rode out of Santa Fe 10 days ago. He should be here before noon." Another silence. The hawk called again, distant and sharp, over the open plain. It was Myra Calloway who broke it. She stepped off the porch of the general store and said, in a voice much louder than her usual nervous whisper, "I think you had better put your hand away from that gun, Walt. I think a great many people in this town have been waiting a long time for a morning like this one." Someone else moved, then someone else. The people on the porch descended into the street, not aggressively, not in a mob, but in the quiet, deliberate way of a community finding its feet after a long time of not having them, taking up positions that said clearly and without violence that the sheriff was alone in this moment, in a way that he had never been alone before. Pruett stood in the middle of the street and looked around him and understood what he was seeing. He took his hand away from his gun. He did not ride out. He was too proud and too calculating for that. He stood in the street and said nothing more and eventually walked back to the jail, and the morning went on and the town breathed, and Sarah turned around to look at Gideon. "Is the marshal actually coming?" she asked, quietly enough that only he could hear. "He is," Gideon said. "I received word day before yesterday. I was going to tell you this morning, but the morning moved faster than I planned." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You could have told me immediately." "You are right, I should have." "Yes," she said, "you should have." He held her gaze without flinching from the mild reproach in it. "I am sorry," he said. And something about the directness of that apology, the way he did not justify or explain or qualify it, simply acknowledged and apologized, did something to the structure of her resistance that she had been maintaining so carefully. She felt it go, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way a dam lets water through when one stone shifts, quietly and irreversibly. "All right," she said. "Come inside and have some coffee, and tell me everything." Marshal Samuel Cross arrived in Redemption at 11 in the morning, accompanied by 2 deputies, and the thing that followed was not swift or simple, but it was thorough. Cross was a tall man in his 40s with a mustache that had gone gray at the ends and a manner that was businesslike without being unkind. He read Sarah's letter, which he had clearly already read and thought carefully about, and he interviewed her for almost 2 hours in the schoolhouse while his deputies secured the jail. He interviewed Gideon for nearly as long. He examined the letters from Cole Keene's tin box, which Gideon had kept carefully wrapped in oilcloth in the inside pocket of his coat for 3 weeks. He examined Daniel Dugan's records, which Sarah retrieved from the locked box in her desk, the records that Daniel had kept so carefully and which had cost him so much. He arrested Walt Pruett on charges of corruption, extortion, and conspiracy in the deaths of Daniel Dugan and Cole Keene. Pruett was taken out of Redemption that same afternoon in handcuffs, on the road north toward the county seat, and he did not look back as he went, and the town of Redemption watched him go and then stood in the street for a moment in a collective silence that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but something that lived between them, the complicated feeling of a long winter that has finally broken, and the fact that the thaw cannot undo the damage the winter did. Sarah watched from the porch of the schoolhouse, and Gideon came to stand beside her as Pruett's figure disappeared around the bend in the north road, and neither of them said anything for a long time. "Cole," Gideon said finally. It was not a question and not a statement, just the name, released into the air like something that had been held too tightly and needed to be let go. "He did not die for nothing," Sarah said. "What he saw and what he wrote down helped bring this about. He was brave enough to write it down even when he was frightened." Gideon was quiet. She could feel the weight of what he was carrying, the grief of a brother confirmed dead, the grief of having the truth be exactly as bad as he had suspected. She did not try to lighten it with words. She simply stood beside him and let the morning be what it was, and after a while he turned his head and looked at her, and she looked back, and the thing between them that had been gathering weight and shape and color for 3 weeks was there between them fully, and neither of them pretended it was not. "Sarah," he said. "Yes," she said, and it was an answer to something he had not asked yet, but they both understood what she was answering. He reached out and took her hand, there on the porch of the schoolhouse with half of redemption still in the street below them, and she let him take it, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world and also like the bravest thing she had done in 2 years. "I need some time to," he stopped, began again. "There are things I need to see to. Arrangements for Cole, writing to my mother, speaking with the marshal about what comes next in terms of testimony and proceedings." "I know," she said. "But after that," he said, "after all of that, I would like to stay in redemption, if that is possible." "I believe the Carver land is still available for lease," she said. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but was very close to one, warmer and more complicated. "I believe it is," he agreed. He held her hand for another moment and then released it, because they were still in public and there were still proprieties to observe. But the releasing was gentle and was not a letting go. It was only a deferral, and she knew the difference and was satisfied with it. The weeks that followed were full of the practical and the necessary. Marshal Cross and his deputies conducted a thorough investigation, interviewing ranchers who had lost livestock and residents who had witnessed things they had been afraid to report, building the case against Pruett layer by layer. 2 other men were implicated in the scheme, ranch hands who had done the actual moving of cattle on Pruett's orders, and they were dealt with through the proper proceedings at the county seat. Cole Keene's remains were found, as Gideon had feared they would be, on a piece of land out past the South Road, a place that had clearly been used as a disposal ground for things Pruett needed to make disappear. The discovery was terrible, and Gideon bore it with a grief that was quiet and deep, and that Sarah saw in his face during the days it took to see to the proper burial. He arranged for Cole to be buried in the Redemption Cemetery, in ground that was peaceful and well-maintained, and he wrote the longest, most painful letter of his life to his mother, who lived in Missouri, and who received the news with the distant, muffled devastation of a woman who had already suspected the truth for a long time but had been hoping she was wrong. Sarah attended the burial. She stood at a little distance, not wanting to intrude on his grief, but close enough that he would know she was there. When it was over and the small gathering had dispersed, she waited by the cemetery gate, and he came to her, and she did not say anything, and he stood for a moment very close to her with his head bent, and then he said very quietly, "Thank you for being here." "There is nowhere else I would be," she said. He looked at her then, and the grief in his face was real and present, but underneath it was something else, something that had been building since the first time he had appeared in the doorframe of her schoolhouse, and she recognized it because she had been feeling it too, that warmth and gravity that had no sensible name in polite language, but that everyone who had ever experienced it knew without needing to be told. "I am not very graceful about some things," he said. "I can do most practical things competently. I can manage cattle and repair fences and read a piece of land and do what needs to be done in a difficult situation. But I am," he stopped, seemed to be measuring his words with unusual care, even for him. "I am not practiced at saying what I feel, particularly to someone whose opinion of me matters to me as much as yours does." "I know," she said gently. "You do not have to be graceful about it." "What I feel for you," he said, and his voice was careful and very earnest, and it was one of the most sincere things she had ever heard from another person, "is not something I was expecting to feel. Not here. Not now, not in the middle of all of this. But it is there and it is real, and I think you deserve to know that, whether or not it is something you—" "Gideon," she said. He stopped. "I know," she said. A moment's pause. "You know. I know what you are trying to say, and I know that I feel it too, and I would like very much if you would not make me wait any longer to hear you say it clearly." He looked at her for one more breath, and then he said, "I love you, Sarah. I love you, and I intend to do this properly as circumstances and my limitations allow." She had not cried when Pruett was arrested. She had not cried at the burial. But now, at the cemetery gate in the clean September light, something behind her eyes went warm and liquid, and she let it. Because she was alone with him, and she had been holding things together for 2 years, and she was allowed to feel this. "You are doing it very properly," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, and she did not care. He reached out and cupped her face in one careful hand, his palm rough from years of work and warm from the afternoon sun, and she leaned into it very slightly, and he looked at her with an expression of such complete and unguarded feeling that she felt it all the way through to the center of herself. "I would very much like to court you," he said. "With your permission." "You have it," she said. "You have had it for some time." He lowered his head and pressed his lips to her forehead, gentle and sure and completely devastating in the best possible way, and she closed her eyes, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt something in her that had been braced and watchful and holding on begin, very carefully, to rest. The courtship that followed was one of the more quietly wonderful things that Redemption, New Mexico, had witnessed in a long time, or at least that was how Myra Calloway described it later, and Myra was not wrong. Gideon was, as he had warned, not naturally graceful at the expression of feeling, but he was thoughtful and consistent and present in a way that said more than any graceful speech could have. He rode into town from the Carver land, which he had formally leased in October and was beginning the slow work of making viable again, 3 or 4 times a week, and he always called on Sarah properly, at her door with his hat in his hands, and they would walk or sit on the porch or share a meal in the company of Myra or one of the other respectable women in town, because propriety mattered to him on Sarah's behalf in a way that touched her deeply. He brought her books when he could find them. He brought her the turquoise more formally, cleaned and polished, set in a simple silver frame that he had made by the jeweler in the next town over, which was not a cheap thing to commission on a ranch hand's income, and she wore it on a cord around her neck and touched it sometimes without realizing she was doing it. He told her stories about Cole, the funny ones, the ones that made him laugh even through the grief, and she understood that sharing them with her was a form of healing he was allowing himself, and she received them carefully and with laughter and with love. She loved him. She had understood this by the time they stood at the cemetery gate, but she had been a widow who believed in the importance of things being done right, and she was grateful for the time of courtship, grateful for the space to move from understanding a feeling to living in it comfortably. She found that loving Gideon Keene was remarkably easy, not in the sense of being without difficulty, because 2 people making room for each other in their established lives always has difficulty in it, but in the sense of being natural. It felt like something that made sense in the structure of the world, the way good tools fit a good hand, the way a key fits a lock it was made for. He asked her to marry him on a January evening in 1883, on the porch of her house with the cold air sharp around them and the stars brilliant and very close overhead, the way they always were in the high desert winter. He had asked her first if she was warm enough, and when she said she was, he had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said her name in the particular way that meant something specific was coming, and she had turned to look at him. He had a ring. He had made the trip to Santa Fe in December for the purpose, which she had not known, and which made her breath catch when she understood it. It was a simple band of silver with a small inlaid piece of turquoise, which she recognized immediately as a reference to the first piece he had ever brought her, and the recognition made the back of her throat ache with the particular sweetness of being known. "I have been thinking about what I want to say," he told her, "for 3 months. I had a very elegant speech prepared. I have forgotten all of it." "Tell me what you remember," she said softly. "I remember that you are the bravest person I know. I remember that this town and this life are better for having you in them, and that I would like my life specifically to be better for having you in it, for as long as you will allow that. I remember that I love you with everything I am and everything I am capable of, and that I would like to spend a great deal of time proving that to you." He paused. "I think that covers the important points." "It covers all the important points," she agreed. "Will you marry me, Sarah?" "Yes," she said. "Gideon, yes." He put the ring on her finger, and the turquoise caught the starlight and glowed blue, and she looked at it for a moment and then looked at him. And he was looking at her with that completely unguarded expression that she had come to love and treasure. And she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he turned his face slightly into her palm the way he had learned she liked, the mirroring of that first moment at the cemetery gate. And then she stood on the balls of her feet and kissed him. Properly and fully, with the cold stars overhead and the desert silence around them and nothing in the world but the warmth of him, and the simple, enormous, irreplaceable fact of being loved. They were married in March of 1883 in the Redemption Church, by the Reverend Thomas Hadley, who had been in town for 2 years, and who had a great deal of quiet respect for both of them. The ceremony was small because they were not people who needed spectacle, but it was full, because Redemption had come to understand that these two people represented something the town had needed for a long time, the particular courage of individuals who stand up for the truth even when it costs them something, and the town wanted to honor that in the small ways available to it. Myra Calloway cried through most of the ceremony, which she had predicted she would, and had prepared for by bringing 2 handkerchiefs. Old Pete Mallory stood in the back with his hat in his hands and a private smile on his face. The children from Sarah's schoolroom, seated in their best clothes in the front pews, were briefly very solemn and then increasingly excited, and were eventually reminded to sit still by their teacher, who was too happy to be very stern about it. Gideon spoke his vows in the direct, unhurried way he did everything, looking at Sarah's face the whole time, and his voice did not waver, and his eyes were very dark and very warm. Sarah spoke hers clearly and without hesitation, because she had decided when she agreed to marry him that she was going to mean every word with her whole self, and she did. The ring was already on her finger. He held her hands through the vows, and then, when the Reverend had pronounced them husband and wife, he kissed her in a way that was entirely proper for a church and entirely full of everything that lived between them. And the small gathered crowd of Redemption expressed its collective approval in the restrained but genuine way of communities that have weathered something difficult together and are glad to be on the other side of it. The Carver land became the Keene Ranch, though Sarah continued to teach because the children needed her, and she needed the work in the way that people who love their vocation need it, not out of financial desperation, but out of the genuine fullness that a calling gives to a life. She rode out to the ranch on the days she did not teach, learning the rhythms of the land and the work, discovering that she had more practical capability than her Boston upbringing had ever suggested she might, that she was stronger and more adaptable than she had known before the West had asked her to be. Gideon worked the land with the focused, patient competence that characterized everything he did, building up the ranch steadily, not rushing, doing it right. He was a good rancher, and he was becoming a respected presence in the community, not the loud or political kind, but the reliable kind, the kind that people knew they could call on when something needed doing, and that would show up without complaint and do the work. In the summer of 1883, they received word from the county seat that Walt Pruett had been convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The 2 men who had worked with him received lesser sentences. The news arrived in a letter from Marshal Cross, who had kept in touch with Sarah as the proceedings moved through the courts, and who added a personal note at the end of the letter saying that her testimony and her careful record-keeping had been essential to the prosecution's case. Sarah read the letter at the kitchen table in the ranch house, and Gideon sat across from her and watched her face as she read it. "Justice," she said when she finished, and the word held everything Daniel and Cole and the 2 years of being careful and the mourning in the street and all of it. Not everything that should be fixed, Gideon said honestly, but something. Yes, she agreed. Something. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the box where she kept things worth keeping, alongside Daniel's records and Cole's letters and the turquoise cord from before the ring had replaced it. And she felt the weight of the past settle into something that was not gone but was at rest, the way grief settles when it has been properly acknowledged, and honesty has been allowed to do its necessary work. Gideon's mother, whose name was Eleanor, came to visit from Missouri in the autumn of 1883. She was a small woman with gray-streaked hair and her younger son's dark eyes, and she had a quality of stillness about her that Sarah recognized as the earned stillness of someone who had endured significant loss without being broken by it. She stayed for 2 weeks, sleeping in the guest room of the ranch house that Sarah had prepared with the best linen she had, and in those 2 weeks, something happened between the two women that was important and lasting. Gideon Keene went to her younger son's grave. She stood there for a long time with Gideon on one side of her and Sarah on the other, and she did not speak much, but she held each of their hands through the whole of it, and afterward she said, "He would have liked you very much, Sarah. He liked people who had backbone. He did not have much patience for people who did not." "He sounds wonderful," Sarah said. "He was," Eleanor said. "He was exactly wonderful. He was not always wise, but he was wonderful." She paused, looking at the grave marker. "He would have been glad to know you finally found the answer, Gideon. He would not have wanted you to go on not knowing." "I know," Gideon said. "He would have been very happy about the two of you," Eleanor added, with the directness of a woman who had earned the right to say what she meant. "He always thought you were too solitary, too determined to be self-sufficient. He thought you needed someone who would argue with you when you needed arguing with." Sarah glanced sideways at Gideon. "I do argue with him when he needs it," she said. "Good," Eleanor said firmly, and for the first time in the visit she smiled fully, and the smile was Gideon's smile, direct and warm and just slightly more effective than it had any right to be. "Good. Someone has to." In the spring of 1884, Sarah told Gideon she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen of the ranch house on a Tuesday morning, matter-of-factly, because she was not a dramatic person, and she did not believe in building toward announcements, and she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions so rapid and so unguarded that she would remember it for the rest of her life. Surprise and then understanding and then something so enormous and uncontained that it made him look, for one brief moment, younger and less guarded than she had ever seen him. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her, not dramatically, but firmly, his arms around her and his face pressed into her hair, and she felt the warmth of him and the solidity and the realness of it, and she put her arms around his waist and held on. "A baby," he said very quietly into her hair. "A baby," she confirmed. He pulled back and looked at her face, his hands cupping her face the way he had learned to do, and which still made her feel like she was something precious and considered. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said honestly, "and very, very glad." Their son was born in November of 1884, in the ranch house with the doctor from Redemption in attendance and Myra Calloway present as Sarah had requested, because Myra was the person she most trusted to be steady and kind in difficult moments. The labor was long and the doctor was competent, and Gideon waited outside the bedroom door, with the particular controlled anxiety of a man who is very good in a crisis, but is completely helpless in this specific one. And when the baby's first cry came through the door, he sat down on the floor of the hallway with his back against the wall and pressed his hands over his face for a moment before standing back up. Myra opened the door and said, "You have a son. They are both well." He went in. Sarah was exhausted and radiant in the way that only people who have just done something enormous can be, and she was holding the baby with the careful, slightly awed look of someone who is meeting the most important person they have ever met. The baby was red-faced and absolutely furious about being alive, which Gideon would later say was a promising sign of character. "Come and meet him," Sarah said. He sat beside her on the bed and looked at his son, and his expression was so completely open and awed and utterly without defense that Sarah felt tears come to her eyes again, the third or fourth time she had cried in their time together, and she was beginning to think that he was simply going to be a person who made her cry sometimes, not from sadness, but from the frequency with which he showed her feelings that were too large for any other response. "What is his name?" Myra asked from the doorway, giving them space but not quite able to resist. Sarah looked at Gideon. They had discussed names, had circled around several possibilities without settling. She had not pushed. She had wanted to see what he wanted. "Cole," Gideon said, and his voice was very steady and very sure. "His name is Cole Daniel Keene." Sarah reached up and touched his face with her free hand, and he turned and looked at her, and they were both quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when something has been given the name it was always meant to have. "Cole Daniel," she said. "Yes." Cole Daniel Keene grew into a boy who had his father's dark eyes and his mother's relentless curiosity, who asked questions with the same frequency and persistence that characterized both his parents in their different ways. He learned to ride early, which was inevitable given where he lived and who his father was, and he learned to read early, which was equally inevitable given who his mother was, and the combination made him a child who could follow a horse trail in the morning and be found deeply absorbed in the pages of a novel by afternoon, which Gideon found deeply satisfying, and which Sarah found deeply gratifying. Redemption continued to change and grow in the years after Pruett's conviction. A new sheriff was appointed from the county seat, a man named Harris who was genuinely honest and competent, and who worked with the community rather than over it, which took some adjustment for a town that had been controlled for so long, but which ultimately felt like the proper way for things to be. New families came. The railroad was discussed, though it would not arrive for several more years. A proper school building was built in 1885, replacing the cramped single room where Sarah had taught for years, and she stood at the door of the new building on the first day it opened and felt a pride in it that was also a kind of love, the love of someone who has invested themselves in something and seen it grow. In 1886, she told Gideon she was expecting again. This time he was in the kitchen with her when she told him, which was the same location as before, which she thought was fitting. He received the news with the warm, quiet steadiness of a man who had grown into fatherhood with his characteristic completeness, who loved his son with a depth that had surprised even him, and who was not afraid of that depth but was grateful for it. Their second child was a daughter, born in the summer of 1887 with considerably less difficulty than the first, small and pink, and equipped from her first hours with a look of serene determination that made the doctor laugh and made Gideon say she was the image of her mother, which Sarah took as the compliment he intended it to be. They named her Eleanor, after the grandmother who received the news in Missouri with the particular joy of someone who has lived long enough to know that good things are worth celebrating fully. Cole was 2.5 years older than Eleanor, and regarded her at first with the cautious suspicion of a child whose world has just been significantly altered, and then with the possessive pride of a child who has decided that this small, determined person is actually quite worthwhile and belongs to him specifically. It was a transition that took about 3 weeks, and afterward he was the kind of older brother who would have arguments with anyone who said anything disparaging about his sister, and would also privately tease her without mercy in the way that only siblings can. The Keene Ranch grew in those years, not dramatically but solidly, the way things grow when they are tended with patience and knowledge and genuine care. Gideon added cattle in the 2nd year, sheep in the 4th, a proper barn in the 5th. He hired 2 men to work with him, both of them carefully chosen, both of them men he had satisfied himself were honest before he brought them on, because the lesson of Cole and of Pruett, and of the corruption that could grow in an enterprise under dishonest leadership, was not one he was ever going to forget. Sarah taught until the summer of 1888, when she made the decision, not easily and not without grief, to step back from the schoolroom to focus on the children and the ranch and the life that had grown beyond what she could fully manage while also holding the responsibility of a classroom. She recommended her replacement, a young woman named Frances Hart who had come to Redemption the previous year from Kansas and who was excellent. And she sat in the back of the school on Frances's first day and told herself she was only there to make sure the transition was smooth, though she stayed for 3 hours and cried slightly on the way home because a classroom is a place where a great deal of a person's heart gets left, and she had left a great deal of hers in that small building over the years. She was not idle after that, she wrote. She had always had the capacity for it, the clear, organized mind that could build an argument or a narrative with the same precision she had applied to lesson plans, and she began writing for a paper in Santa Fe, sending essays on subjects ranging from education in the territories to the importance of accurate record-keeping in local governance, which was a subject she had more than personal experience with. The essays were published under her full name, because she had decided long ago that the practice of hiding behind initials was a concession to a world that undervalued women's thinking, and she was not interested in making concessions of that nature anymore. Gideon read every essay she wrote before she sent them, not to edit. He was clear about this, but because he wanted to read them. He would sit at the kitchen table with the pages in his hands and read with complete attention, and when he finished, he would look at her with that expression that meant he was proud in a way that had nothing competitive or qualified about it. The pure, simple pride of someone who is glad that someone they love is exactly who they are. "You are very good at this," he would say. "You always say that," she would reply. "It is always true," he would say, and that was the whole conversation, and it was enough. In the autumn of 1889, a letter came from Gideon Keene in Missouri. She had not been well, she wrote, in the careful way of someone who does not want to cause alarm but is also past the age of pretending everything is fine. Gideon read the letter at the table and then folded it and was quiet for a while. "She should come here," Sarah said. He looked at her. "It would be a significant disruption to the household." "Gideon," she said patiently, "your mother is not well and she is alone in Missouri. She should come here." He looked at her for another moment, and then something in his face relaxed completely, the particular relaxation of a man who has been holding a tension he was not fully conscious of holding and has just been given permission to set it down. "Yes," he said, "she should." Gideon Keene came to Redemption in the spring of 1890. With 2 trunks and a rocking chair she refused to leave behind because it had been her mother's, and she moved into the guest room that became hers permanently and spent her days in something that looked very much like contentment. She was not the kind of woman who sat and did nothing, and she was useful around the house in ways that were practical and appreciated, and she was very fond of Cole and Gideon in the clear, uncomplicated way of grandmothers who have no parenting agenda and can simply enjoy. Cole adored her. Gideon, his sister, regarded her grandmother with the same serene, appraising look she turned on most things, and then decided she approved, and that was that. Gideon Keene Sr. taught Sarah to make a particular kind of Missouri pie that was nothing like the desert food Sarah had learned to cook in her years in New Mexico, and the 2 women spent several evenings in the kitchen working through the recipe, with the companionable focus of people who have found they enjoy each other's company precisely as much as they expected to, and possibly slightly more. They talked about everything in those kitchen evenings, about the children, about the territory, about Missouri and Boston, and the different shapes that lives can take. And Sarah thought sometimes that she had gained more than a husband when she married Gideon Keene, though the husband was the center of it, the radiant center of everything she had found in Redemption that she had not been looking for and could not now imagine being without. On an evening in September of 1890, 8 years to the month since Gideon had first ridden into Redemption on his dusty roan horse, Sarah found him standing at the fence of the east pasture at the end of the day, watching the last of the light go out of the sky over the Sandia Mountains. She came to stand beside him, close enough that their arms were touching in that comfortable, undemonstrative way of two people who have been together long enough that physical proximity is simply the natural state and does not require occasion. 8 years, she said. Yes, he said, and she could tell he had been thinking the same thing. The sky over the mountains was doing the thing it sometimes did in September, going through amber and gold, and a particular deep rose color that had no name in English that she knew of, a color that was specifically the property of the high desert evening and nowhere else on earth. The horses moved quietly in the pasture below them. From the house behind them came the sound of children and a leaner Keene Sr.'s voice telling someone to wash their hands before supper, and the sound was so utterly domestic and so entirely hers that it settled in her chest like a stone settling into warm earth. "Are you happy?" he asked, and the question was simple and direct and did not carry any of the anxiety that might have surrounded it in a different relationship, only a genuine wanting to know. She considered this properly, the way he would want her to, not with automatic reassurance but with actual thought. Was she happy? She thought about the classroom she had loved and left. She thought about Daniel, whom she had loved and lost and would always carry as a part of the architecture of herself. She thought about the turquoise ring on her finger and the essays in the Santa Fe paper and Cole and Alina growing up in this specific landscape with these specific parents and these particular values. And she thought about Gideon standing beside her at fences and kitchen tables and cemetery gates for 8 years, steady and present and entirely himself. "Yes," she said, genuinely and completely. He turned and looked at her, and she looked back, and the evening light caught in the angles of his face and made him look, for a moment, like the stranger who had ridden in from the east 8 years ago. The man she had not known would become her whole life. And then he smiled, that warm and slightly rare smile that she had never stopped being glad to see, and she thought that the word stranger had always been the wrong word for him, that he had never been a stranger at all, only someone she had not yet met. She leaned into him, shoulder to shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together at the fence watching the mountains go dark under the enormous New Mexico sky, and there was nothing left unfinished, nothing left unresolved, nothing in the world that needed to be different from exactly what it was. The night came on slowly, the way night comes in the desert, star by star out of a sky that goes from rose to purple to a darkness so clear and so full of light that it seemed almost generous. Cole's voice came from the house, calling for his mother, and she pushed away from the fence with a smile and said she was coming, and she was almost to the porch when she heard Gideon say her name behind her. She turned. He was still at the fence, his arm braced on the top rail, looking at her across the yard with the evening dark behind him and the lamplight from the windows catching the side of his face. And the look on his face was the one she would always love most, the open, unguarded, unhurried one, the one that said she was seen and loved and not going anywhere. "I love you," he said, simply and without occasion, the way he said things that he meant completely. She smiled at him across the yard. "I love you, Gideon Keene," she said. She went inside to her children and her mother-in-law and her life, and he stayed a moment longer at the fence with the stars coming out over the Sandia Mountains. And then he came inside too, into the warm and lit kitchen where supper was waiting and family was gathered, into the life they had built together on the honest ground of truth and courage and love. The door closed behind him, and the night settled over the Keene ranch, and the stars over New Mexico were brilliant and very close, and everything was exactly as it should be.